This is the story of an orphan bobcat kitten rescued by the Blue Ridge Wildlife Center when its den was destroyed by a bulldozer and its mother fled the area. Bobcats are native to all of Virginia, but are now very rare in northern Virginia due to the large amount of development and habitat destruction that has taken place. Most of the animals rescued by the Blue Ridge Wildlife Center have become injured or orphaned as a consequence of the development that is taking place within their habitat. That is what happened to this young bobcat. On May 23, 2011, a single orphan 5-week-old bobcat kitten was rescued and brought to our wildlife center because her den had been bulldozed and her mother couldn't be found. This frightened little female kitten was lonely and cried constantly for her mother. She needed a companion. If we raised her without a companion, we knew she would bond to people and become too tame to release back into the wild. We didn't want this beautiful wild animal to have to spend her entire life in captivity. We were not able to find another orphan bobcat, so we had to look for another solution. Feral domestic cats are very much like bobcats in behavior and temperament, so we decided to search the local animal shelters for a feral domestic kitten to act as a companion. Fortunately, a feral kitten very close in age to this bobcat was found at a local shelter. He was so wild and unfriendly, the shelter felt he was unadoptable. After vaccinating, leukemia and FIV testing negative, and a short quarantine, the two kittens were placed together. These two very shy kittens quickly became fast friends. While raising these kittens at the Wildlife Center, we relied on surveillance cameras to observe the cats' behavior so we would have as little contact with them as possible and prevent them from becoming habituated to humans. The rest of this video was recorded with remote cameras. The technique currently recommended to wildlife rehabilitators for raising a single orphan bobcat kitten is to dress up in a bobcat costume and play with the kitten a couple of times a day. We didn't feel this technique would fool a bobcat or prevent it from becoming tame. We also didn't feel a person could ever interact with the kitten in a way that would teach it the behaviors it would need to know to survive in the wild. By raising this bobcat with another member of a closely related cat species, their interactions would be much more cat-like. Playing and interacting with another cat would improve the bobcat's coordination and its hunting behaviors and give it a better chance of survival in the wild. The behaviors of these two different cat species were very similar, but we did notice a couple of differences. The bobcat liked water. A lot. For enrichment and to prevent boredom, we placed logs and a pool in the cage. The bobcat spent a lot of time in the water. The domestic cat ignored the pool completely. Sometimes we placed live fish in the pool. The domestic cat wanted to catch the fish too, but still wouldn't put more than its paw in the water. Another difference we noticed was the domestic cat preferred cat food, while the bobcat preferred to eat almost exclusively mice and rats. The bobcat sometimes played intensely with the dead rats before eating them. The cat's cage was placed in an area where they would not see or hear people except when we went into the cage once a day to clean and change the water. The cats would usually hide as soon as we approached the cage, and we were careful not to let them associate us with food because we did not want the bobcat to ever approach people looking for food. Even though these cats are of two different species, they bonded very well. When the domestic cat had to leave for a day to be neutered, the bobcat called and looked for him all day. The female bobcat was not spayed. After the neutering and once the cats were 5 months old, it was time to move them to a release site. In early September, we took the cats to an isolated release site in an undeveloped part of northern Virginia with good bobcat habitat. A wild bobcat had been spotted on this farm a year earlier. A release cage similar to their cage at the center was placed there for them to use as a den, to to prevent them from immediately fleeing this unfamiliar area, and a feeding station with an observation camera was set up so we could monitor their activity. The cats were fed at this site daily. This farm already cares for some feral domestic cats, so the domestic cat will have a constant food supply there. So far, the cats have completely avoided people. This is very important for the bobcat because if she were to approach a person, she would probably be viewed as a threat and might be killed. Initially, the cats were coming back for food mostly during the day, and usually they were together. Eventually, the bobcat stopped coming back every day, probably because she was catching food on her own. After a couple of months, the bobcat was coming for food only after dark. In the wild, bobcats are nocturnal. The two cats were still playing and feeding together until late November. Now the two cats are never seen together. The domestic cat returns daily and appears to be living in the release den, and the bobcat only returns occasionally. Wildlife rehabilitation is caring for injured, orphaned, and sick wild animals and preparing them for life in the wild again. We are very proud that this female bobcat was able to be released back into the wild.